Ka mihi nui ki a tātou katoa. On behalf of the University of Otago, it gives me great pleasure to open this Catchments Otago Symposium. I'm sure Professors Kath Dickinson, Jerry Kloss, and Phil Seddon are delighted with the presence of so many expert and highly respected speakers and such a well-informed and multidisciplinary audience from throughout the country. I'm confident that the sessions, with their emphases on water, biodiversity, health and society, will engender considerable discussion and greatly inform the work being undertaken by this research theme. They will assist in developing robust approaches for sharing natural resources and for considering environmental, social and economic outcomes. Of course, the starting point of any environmental evaluation requires a principled approach to address conflicts and incommensurability inevitably involved when making value judgments about how to manage the protection, use and management of the natural and physical resources of a river catchment. I contend that these principles should always be informed by the ethics of kaitiakitanga and stewardship. I suggest that effective law and policy responses to achieve the sustainable management of the natural and physical resources of a river catchment require a strong directive regulatory policy and planning regime to be implemented by central and local government. Self-regulatory approaches and economic instruments alone are not sufficient. I see Associate Professor Nicola Huyn in attendance. Nicola has written about the need to focus more on the conservation and protection of the environment and not to shift the legislative emphasis too far towards enabling the use and development of natural and physical resources if there are to be sustainable environmental outcomes. I endorse this view. I'm sure we're all looking forward to the presentations, discussions, and the launch of Dr. Brian Turner's and Mr. Sam Mant book, Riverscapes. So I can congratulate the organisers of the symposium. It now gives me great pleasure to introduce our first speaker, the Honourable David Parker, Attorney General, Minister for the Environment, Minister for Economic Development, Minister for Trade and Export Growth, and Associate Minister of Finance. The Minister was an outstanding environmental lawyer and a leading businessman before becoming a Member of Parliament. We were delighted when he became Minister for the Environment, which is a testament to the importance of that portfolio. It's very reassuring that such an experienced and highly ranked minister is developing the policy framework to address challenging, significant and complex environmental issues which confront our shared humanity. I recently heard the Minister speak on the policy imperatives of the government in respect of the environment. His focus on water is particularly apposite for this symposium. I'd also like to take this opportunity to congratulate you, Minister, on the superb outcome in respect of the proposed America's Cup development in Auckland. Your skilled leadership and ability to factor in important environmental impacts against the economic and social benefits of the project provide a model approach for addressing relevant competing values. However, I suggest, sir, that your greatest achievements are being a son of Dunedin and a graduate of the University of Otago. Ladies and gentlemen, I invite you to welcome the Honourable David Parker. Kia ora tātou. Yes, certainly.
That's great. Thank you. Is that on? So many friends. Tēnā koutou katoa. It really is lovely to be here. Thank you, Royden, for that. I cut my teeth on litigation involving Royden Somerville. He and the late Jim Guthrie were the two best water lawyers in the country by far. and I never approached their aptitude, but I did learn at their feet, and I remember one case in particular which I'm very proud of, which was the Mataura Water Conservation case where Royden was on the other side. And I see Neil Watson there. You know, Neil was my instructing client on many occasions, and you know, people like Alan Mark fighting for to save Manapori. You know, it's where there, you know, I'm sure there are councillors in the room. Put your hands up. There we go, mayors. I see Tim Cadogan there. Stephen Woodhead, chair of the regional council. Brian. Is Gretchen here? I missed Gretchen. Hello, Gretchen. You know, there's so many people here doing great work for water, so it's a real pleasure to be here. I really feel most at home in Otago. You know, I've still got a house up in London Street where I've spent the weekend. I normally curse my children for leaving me with all the detritus of life, but my father died at the end of last year and I had to clean out his garage and realised that this is an intergenerational problem because most of the rubbish was mine. So look, it's great to be pleased to be here as Minister for the Environment. In the past, you know, over the years, I've talked to many of you about what I want to see happen for rivers in New Zealand, particularly Otago rivers, and now I'm in a position to help make those things happen, so it's a great privilege. You know, at a simple level, we want to see our fresh water and water. Is Brian Turner here? Have I missed Brian? Brian, you were hiding there. Sorry, yeah. Brian, it's someone else I should acknowledge. You know, Brian, I think, has had a lifetime of frustration at the degradation of New Zealand's waterways, and has been very, very articulate in the way that you've expressed that. And is that Sam Mann sitting next to him, the man who makes effigies made of Nick Smith, made of not of metal, another warrior for the environment. Now, before I say a bit more about water, I want to put our ambition for healthy and swimmable rivers into a broader context. And that is that I'm someone who really believes that we can achieve economic growth within environmental limits. I've never accepted the proposition that you have to choose between one and t'other. And I think it's true that we're facing some very big challenges as a world and as a country. The challenge of the shocking decline in the health of some of our waterways brings me here today, but there are lots of other environmental challenges around the world, whether it's declining fish stocks or climate changing gases or the sea of plastic in the sea or particulate, you know, pollution in other countries, you know, loss of soils, salination of some areas, you know, rising sea levels. You know, the challenges are legion. And some, like climate change, I think are becoming more and more real for people year by year. I think this year was a bit of a shock for people, you know, kingfish being caught off Karitani. You know, it's happened before, but it's happening more and more often. Hottest summer we've had on record in New Zealand. The strength of recent storm events. I was on the west coast last week looking at some issues there that, you know, they had the tail end of some cyclones there that have caused some significant damage. We've got social challenges. We've got social challenges in the health system. We've got increasing homelessness, and we've got a critical, you know, lack of affordable homes. And now on that, I'm involved in trying to deal with some of the planning aspects of how we expand supply with environmental limits. And Royden, thank you for your comments about the America's Cup. That actually was quite a difficult battle, and it ought not to have been. It ought not to have been. In the end, we achieved an outcome that reduced an intrusion into the harbour from 22,000 square metres to 6,000 square metres, and we saved the country tens of millions of dollars in the process, excluding the environmental benefit. When properly valued, that environmental benefit, which was like, it was about 400 square metre sections, which were themselves, if they're waterfront sections, that's the intrusion into the harbour we avoided. They'd be worth more than $1 million each. So if you properly value the environmental benefit of what we did there, it was another $50 million in addition to the $50+ million of cash that we saved. So, you know, these battles, and that was a far more difficult battle than it ought to have been, but we actually did prevail and get to a good outcome there. As many of you know, I spent a good part of my professional life as a lawyer before becoming an MP, and some of that was around environmental and resource issues, including advocating for water conservation orders. As Minister for the Environment in Helen Clark's government, I held the climate change and energy portfolios, amongst other things, and I set New Zealand on a 90% renewable target for electricity, which was derided at the time as being impossible by our political opponents, who said we needed more thermal. We're actually now well on the way to achieving that 90% target without damming more rivers. I held the land information portfolio, which was responsible for tenure review, and I helped protect some, pretty amazing South Island high country and to improve public access. Sadly, a lot of the work that I did there was undone by the subsequent national government, which is just an illustration of how we've just got to keep fighting for these causes all of our life. My drive to pursue environmental causes doesn't come from the technical skills that I've got. It actually comes from values. I have a real passion for the outdoors. I swim, I tramp, I ski. When I want to recharge my batteries, I can think of nothing better than going to go floundering or gathering shellfish around Karitani, or in a peaceful morning in the estuary, or late at night, or going along with a fly rod. And unlike Brian, I hardly ever catch a fish. But just that smell of the water, the sound of the skylarks overhead in central Otago, the smell of the dust, even the popping of the broom pods, which I probably shouldn't celebrate, but just those smells and feelings that you have when you do that, they really make my heart sing. I really love that. I even pretend to surf. So it really is important to me to protect our environment, and it's a lifelong commitment. In terms of New Zealand's economic performance, I think too much of it's come with economic damage, with environmental damage. It's true that our headline growth rate in recent years, our nominal growth rate, has been okay. It hasn't been starry, but it's been okay compared with a lot of other countries. But when you drill down, it hasn't been so fantastic. It's been built on more people, more cows, and more tourists. When you strip out population growth, our growth rates in the last decade or so have been about 1% per annum, which is not great. And we've got an appalling productivity record. Some of that is caused by imbalances in our tax system, which are being addressed by Michael Cullen in the tax review. And our exports that we sell to the rest of the world in order to pay for things like this and the cars and things we all want for a decent standard of living, our exports have dropped from 30% to 27% of the economy over a decade, when the government's ambition was to increase them from 30 to 40% of GDP. So although it's true that people see New Zealand as an attractive place to visit and live, and we take some pride in this, I think we have to acknowledge that economic management over the recent years hasn't been fantastic. In my view, it hasn't been, as evidenced by that drop in exports. But it's also come at putting pressure on our social well-being and environment. We're seeing environmental limits and pressure points being reached at alarming rates. Countries' homelessness of nearly 1% of the population is higher than any other OECD country. Who would ever have thought that would be true of New Zealand? Pressure on our fresh water through intensification of land use has led to poor water quality, which in turn threatens recreational use and our country's image. Alarmingly, 72% of our native freshwater fish are threatened by or at risk of extinction, including 4 whitebait species, lamprey and longfin eels. Otago has 11 of the threatened native freshwater fish, most in any region in New Zealand. Of course, we also have a lot of fresh water. Our region contains almost a quarter of the country's total lake surface area. Obviously, the 3 largest lakes being Wakatipu, Wanaka and Hawea. The Clutha River, and I presume this is the Clutha River here, is it? Is that the old Clutha Gorge? What a loss, eh? That and actually the earlier Manapori battle is the cause of my environmental activism. The Clutha River has the highest volume of any river in the country. We know it's been dammed for generation in two places. The south generates most of New Zealand's hydroelectricity. Manapori, Aviemore, Benmore, Waitaki, Waipori. In addition to the Clutha, all of these rivers have been dammed and the river ecosystems have been changed forever. The most controversial of these in my lifetime were Manapori. Really interesting for me, and I've discussed this with Sir Alan Mark, that the Manapori campaign started in 1959. It was not resolved until 1972 with the election of the Kirk-led Labour government. 13 years later, it's interesting that the time that it's taken to raise public consciousness around water quality and turn it into a really big political issue has been 13 years. The Growing for Good report that sort of ripped the scab off what was happening or disclosed what was happening by Morgan Williams as Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment was in 2004, and it wasn't until 2017, 13 years later, that we actually got water as an issue throughout an election and won the political battle. In terms of consumptive use in Otago, which is mainly for irrigation, most of our catchments are over-allocated, and some rivers in northern and central Otago can run dry in summer. In central, this is often caused by abstraction allowed by historic mining privileges. As most of you will know, these privileges expire on the 1st of October 2021, and I appreciate the work that the Otago Regional Council is doing in transitioning the privileges to water permits under the Resource Management Act. This work must be completed. We've always known that even though that was such a long date when the RMA was first passed, that there would nonetheless, as the date approached, be more and more pressure for extensions and for inappropriate minimum flows. The Regional Council does have to see this through, and they need our support to do so. While water quality and ecosystem health are high in many parts of Otago, particularly those parts that are in national parks, intensive farming is putting pressure on water quality and aquatic ecosystems, not just in lower river reaches, but I think that we've got some rising pressures in the Manahurukea. And there are also stormwater contamination issues in some urban areas. The political battle has been fought and won, and I think that we should actually bank that, and we should be on an implementation phase now rather than allowing people to try to relitigate the fight that was lost. We have representative democracy in New Zealand, and fresh water quality was one of the prime issues at the last election, and we won. Nevertheless, I do want to take as many people with me as I can, and that's why I'm willing to talk and work with people, a wide range of stakeholders up and down the country. The scale of change needed in respect of land use practices is significant, and it will require coordinated and decisive action by both central and local government, by businesses across a range of industries. Obviously the rural sectors and subject matter experts, as well as the environmental NGOs, scientists, academics and others in the community. We already have huge advantages in New Zealand. Our natural capital is massive, whether it's our forests, our soil, our fresh water, our huge economic zone, our fish stocks, our biodiversity. We're said to be the Saudi Arabia of renewable energy. And this is all true. And I sometimes reflect on the fact that if New Zealand, with all of those advantages, can't overcome our problems, there's very little hope that the world can or will. And that's a pretty depressing outlook for the world, that if these problems, so many of which go beyond national boundaries these days, if a country like New Zealand cannot get it under control, there's very little prospect that the world will. And I prefer to flip that on its head and say, well, we can, and rather than being another source of despair, we can be a beacon of hope in the world. I often quote that former World Bank economist Herman Daly, who says, the economy is a wholly owned subsidiary of the environment, not the reverse. I believe that's true. I think it's self-evident, especially in a country in New Zealand, whose economy is so reliant on those natural resources. It's abundantly true, particularly in the long term. As you know, Land is where the majority of pressures on the environment start, land and people. Land and land use is a common theme running across issues that we face, whether it's water quality, climate change, natural hazard risks, biodiversity or housing affordability. Decisions about what we use land for and our management practices have a significant impact on the outcomes in these areas. So your government is clear that economic growth cannot continue to be at the cost of the environment. This is not just idealism, it's grounded in common sense really. Protecting our environment is about protecting our economy in the long term. This isn't just a view of the Labour Party, it's also shared by our coalition partner New Zealand First and the Greens. Shane Jones was working in DPMC many moons ago when the RMA was passed. He's actually quite a defender of the core principles, although he gets a bit frustrated at the length of processes at times, like a lot of us do. A healthy environment, of course, underpins the well-beings of our communities beyond matters relating to the economy. And we're trying to integrate all these things across government, and Grant Robertson's leading work that by 2019 will see us introduce a living standards framework which will be implemented by the Treasury that measures the impacts of policies across the four capitals: human, social, natural and the financial or physical capital. We're developing a comprehensive set of indicators to better show how we're doing as a country and which will hold us accountable as politicians to New Zealanders. I'm determined that our economic growth will be within environmental limits, because I don't think that we should have to choose between prosperous economy and a clean environment. I believe we can have both. The importance of what we're doing to future generations was brought home to me recently when I visited a low decile school in Stoke Valley near Wellington to mark World Water Day. It was a low decile school, and coming from Dunedin, where we're still a relatively egalitarian population, to be honest, I was reminded how large the social and economic challenges are part of everyday life for some people. There was a very low, parts of this catchment are very low decile. Yet the children were keen to learn and care about the environment. They proudly showed me how they'd planted around the stream banks near the school, how they'd installed sprat ropes in the local creek for the native fish to get up. And as we walked down to the stream, there they were picking up litter. Stopped to tell some people from my office a quick lesson on how to tell a male weta from a female one. Yeah, these children really are our future, and I was moved, still am actually, that providing for their well-being and protecting their birthright of clean water is at the heart of the decisions that we're trying to take. The degradation of our rural waterways in recent years has been caused by intensification of farming systems. Following the Uruguay round of the GATT, the economics of export into growing Asian milk markets meant that New Zealand was the lowest cost producer for a number of years. That and a change to farming technology, including K-line irrigation, centre pivots, affordable pumps, fertiliser trucks, and bigger cows. All of these combined to cause a really fast change in land use to dairying. And whilst I think it was fair for both local government and central government to be a bit surprised at the start of that, how fast that transition happened, I certainly was, and look back and am surprised. By 2004, when Morgan Williams produced that report, we knew. And the outcome of that has been more effluent and nutrients and sediment from farms, made worse by some poor land practice in parts. And in some urban areas, we've still got inadequate separation of stormwater from sewage systems. And these impacts aren't just having effect on ecosystems and indigenous species, they're also impacting on human health. Those of you who've read the Havelock North reports following, or the inquiry following the Havelock North report, will see the high and not properly measured rate of waterborne disease that we've got in New Zealand, Campylobacter and other infections, excessive nitrate levels making some bores unsafe to drink out of in South Canterbury. So, you know, obviously we've got to do better. I grew up swimming in Otago rivers. Most of them aren't as clean today. And this matters to me. I'm someone who even now in summer, when I find a nice river deep enough to swim in on a hot day, particularly if there's no one around, it's hard to keep me out. So I'm pleased to see the Regional Council continuing to engage with communities with what's important to them. You know, regional councils have got a difficult job. I see regional councils around the country. I think the Otago's one's one of the better ones, and we've got to help them. I've got a pretty simple view of what water quality means to most people. I think for most people the most important river is the one they live closest to and use, and I think that anyone should be able to pop down to their local river in summer, put their head under without getting crock. If we do that, then to all our local rivers, if your local river and my local river are clean enough to swim in, then all our rivers will be clean. And I think that that's really the Regional Council's ambition as well. They've got an ambition to achieve 100% swimmability of the region's rivers by 2040. And while this target is couched in terms of people being able to swim safely, pretty similar standards are required to maintain healthy ecosystems and biodiversity. My first priority is to stop further degradation. Sometimes I'm asked by members of rural communities when I'll get off their back. And I say I'll get off their back when things are no longer getting worse. I think they'll have social license to improve things over a period of time once we stop things getting worse anywhere. New Zealanders will allow people a period to clean up and transition back to the way things were once they stopped from getting worse. I think it's a realistic aim for our country to reverse past damage within a generation. And we've got a pretty comprehensive program and lining up to achieve this. I'm determined to see water quality materially improving within 5 years, and for us to develop durable long-term systems for managing freshwater quality and use. We can't change the past, we can only change the future. It is an axiom. In environmental matters, there are only really 3 ways to change the future: education, regulation, and price. There's nothing else you can do. It's a neighbour of mine from Karitani. Sorry, I haven't been looking at the audience close enough. Education, regulation, and price. Anything you do to change the environment falls within one of those 3 criteria. You might, through education or regulation or price, deploy science or encourage innovation, but actually the only 3 ways to change behaviour, and it's our behaviours, are education, regulation, and price. Of these, the most important, and I agree with Royden Somerville, the most important is regulation. OECD studies around the world prove that. New Zealand's experience proves that. And the regulation is important at both local and national level. And the most important instrument in that regard in New Zealand is the National Policy Statement for Freshwater Management, the Freshwater NPS. It's the main regulatory tool because it directs what goes into regional plans. Regional councils have had full authority to do the right thing since the RMA was passed in 1991, came into effect in 1992. They did not need national direction to do what was required, but their failure to do so should have been remedied by better direction from central government long before now. The last government at the end of our term, and I had a hand in it, drafted an NPS that went to Judge Shepherd on a panel. He came out with a version that essentially said that increases in land use intensity should not be a permitted activity anywhere in the country. The prior government spiked that, and cow numbers after that increased by another 1 million throughout the country. They've actually plateaued now for economic reasons more than environmental reasons. they also allowed the price of carbon to collapse to zero, which enabled deforestation on the volcanic plateau, which has made the problems in the Waikato catchment worse. In my view, we do need a more comprehensive freshwater NPS, which I'm looking at now. I'm reviewing the attributes, the deadlines, and I also want the NPCS to cover sedimentation as well as nutrient allocation and land use intensification. I don't want repeated battles up and down the country on the allocation of nutrient discharges. It's a very difficult issue, but it's a difficult issue everywhere. We should be able to have national principles that are applied locally. I've invited the Land and Water Forum to provide advice by the end of May as to how to fairly allocate nutrient and sediment loads across both developed and undeveloped land while meeting science-based ecological bottom lines. I've also asked Law for advice on what can be done now to hold the line to stop water quality from getting worse. Some of these issues are very difficult. There are sheep and beef have a different view to dairy. Holders of undeveloped land have a different view to people who've got developed land. And there's a bit of justice on all sides of these debates. But in the end, if we can't get to a collaborative outcome, someone's got to take a decision, and I'm willing to be that somebody. Officials are developing advice on compulsory exclusion of stock from waterways. Draft regulations were in train, but then they were put on hold by the previous government due to pressure from primary sector groups. I'm also seeking advice on regulating high-risk land management practices like intensive beef feedlots, which are starting to proliferate in places like the Hawke's Bay, spray and pray, which some of you all heard about, and intensive winter grazing on hill slopes. We're looking at a number of other issues which I won't go into. I'm also interested in estuarine protection. I'll say just, because I'm rattling on too long, I'll just say a couple of things about irrigation subsidies. We ran on the idea that you shouldn't be subsidising irrigation. If people want to irrigate their land, then they should meet the cost of that. Last week, the government announced the winding down of these subsidies whilst honouring existing commitments. Effectively, we've said that the Waimea scheme in Nelson and the Kurau-Duntrine scheme are above the line, and other schemes are below the line. Indeed, a lot of the schemes that were on the list, including the Manihira Care scheme or the raising of Falls Dam, actually weren't within the funding envelope that had been budgeted anyway. Smaller scale, locally run, environmentally sustainable water storage projects that can deliver environmental benefits can be considered on a case-by-case basis through the Provincial Growth Fund, but in general, they should not be subsidised. While only a few % of our waterways are in urban areas, some are the dirtiest in the country. Most are in better condition than 20 years ago because a lot of point source discharges have been improved by factories and councils. But as we've seen over summer, a notable exception has been Auckland, which has got serious problems with stormwater intrusions, mixing with sewage, polluting beaches after heavy rainfall events. So I'm pleased to see that in response to public pressure, showing great leadership, the Auckland Council was bringing forward $856 million of expenditure over the next 10 years to reduce stormwater overflows into the sewage system, and as a consequence, it's expected to reduce sewage flows into the stormwater system and onto beaches by between 80 and 90%, which is great progress. This illustrates the need to make progress in cleaning up fresh water in both rural and urban areas. I do get a bit frustrated by those who say we shouldn't have to take responsibility in rural areas because urban areas are poor. Actually, both need to do better. My overall message to industry and council is that more needs to be done to address water quality and more quickly. This includes better compliance, better monitoring and better enforcement. We've also asked primary sector organisations to show greater leadership and commitment, and actually that's starting to come forward. Dairy NZ came to me last week in response to some requests that I made before Christmas with a number of demonstration projects which I think are worthy and should proceed. You know, Kiwis fundamentally do want to do the right thing. They've got a strong environmental ethic. Our forebears saved Manapori, the Blake Robin, put down national parks, stopped logging on the west coast. We can do this. We've got an educated population, we've got the rule of law, we've got wealth, we know how to do this stuff, and we've got these wonderful ethics to draw upon. Our byline at the last election was let's do this, and I'm determined to give it a push. So I really wish you well at your seminar or your symposium, I'm also interested in higher value solutions. I do think that one of the answers lies in more horticulture. Central Otago, whether it's cherries or apricots, technology with sensors, robotics, positioning systems going to enable higher value land uses. More cropping in other parts will be an important part of the solution, but we really have reached the limit in a lot of parts when it comes to intensity of ruminant agriculture. Thank you. Oh, right.
And so this is a river stone from Central Otago that we have engraved.
Oh, that's very nice.
Catchments Otago theme
I'm
that
pretty
I'll
good at
speak.
skipping ones that are slightly smaller than that
Maybe
one.
not this one.
Not that one. Okay.
Thank you
Hey,
very much.
thanks very much.